Welcome, everyone, to a very special edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paola and Ben Eno, Case Files on YouTube. It's July the 3rd, 2021. Joining us today via Zoom is Dr. Jacques F. Vallee, who has long been regarded as the most respected and senior scientific investigator of unidentified aerial phenomena. He was the inspiration for the French UFO researcher Claude Lacombe in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He has investigated reports of UFOs all over the world and has worked on related US and French government projects. He is currently working on a project to analyze UFO materials in a Silicon Valley lab. A native of France, he studied mathematics at the Sorbonne and received a master's degree in astrophysics at Lille University. He earned a doctorate in artificial intelligence from Northwestern University. His work credits in astronomy, government, and information technology are too numerous to mention here. In the context of UFOs, Dr. Vallee was a close associate of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the U.S. Air Force's top scientific consultant on UFOs. Working for Project Blue Book, Dr. Vallee created the first interactive computer database of UFO observations. In the late 1960s, Dr. Vallee began exploring the commonalities between UFOs, the paranormal, and folklore. His observations were detailed in his book, Passport to Magonia, From Folklore to Flying Saucers, in which he suggested a multidimensional hypothesis. As a young seminary student in the same period, I found Dr. Vallee's work inspirational, and after laboring in the paranormal trenches beginning in 1970, I soon found that his conclusions work. Dr. Vallee has written 24 outstanding books. His latest, Trinity, The Best Kept Secret, released in May, and co-authored with Paola Leopizzi Harris, is the primary subject of our discussion today. Speaking of Paola Harris, a good friend of our show, she is an Italian-American journalist widely published in North America and Europe. Paola is an investigative reporter specializing in UFO and extraterrestrial phenomena, which she has studied since 1979. Along with Dr. Vallee, she has rubbed elbows with the likes of Dr. J. Allen Hynek and high-ranking military officers. One of these was Colonel Philip J. Corso in Roswell, New Mexico, and she became his friend and confidant. Their astounding talks, as detailed in Paula's book, Conversations with Colonel Corso, were the subject of our show number 882 from February 7th, 2021. And for anybody listening before the timeline, July 25th will be the day when Paula will be back on our show with our good friend and sometime co-host Steve LaPlume of Rendlesham fame. So let us begin. Usually we're very formal, but let's be informal. Please tell us, starting with you, Dr. Vallee, about the book Trinity and the case behind it.
So it's all Paola's fault, she had been. It's nice when you can blame it on somebody else,
On a woman, yeah.
She had studied that case a long time before me. In this business, as you just mentioned, it helps to have a long timeline to be able to look at it over, many years and over different countries. It's not an accident that this particular case at Trinity, is coming to the attention of the public through, an Italian woman and a Frenchman, because maybe we're more attuned to things that are not obvious in the news every day and so on. And we're looking at the long-term trends around the world. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just the Nimitz. It's not just, what a pilot from an F-18 has seen yesterday. I mean, you have to look at the whole thing if you want to comprehend it. Now, having said that, I have to admit that I came very late to the study of UFO crashes. The reason for that, I obviously heard about Roswell. I was very interested in the analyses that were done. I read the books, but when I talked to scientists and to people here in Silicon Valley, they say, well, this is interesting. The witnesses are telling the truth as they experienced it, but you have not given me something I can take back to the lab that I can put under the microscope, something I can test. Where are the x-rays? Where is the So for a long time, I had those discussions, starting with Dr. Hynek. Dr. Hynek was just as puzzled about Roswell. Yes, something was found, but it was found 2 days after it had crashed. For a long time, nobody knew exactly where it had happened. There were all these questions, and apparently the Army had been there, or the Air Force, and had taken away most of the important data, most of the important material. So I really became interested only about 4 or 5 years ago, when I got information about a case that had been researched already, where there was material that had been dug up out of the desert near Daytil, New Mexico. Daytil is a couple of hours west of Socorro and Albuquerque and that whole region. And I spent some time there with a colleague of mine. We did some research, we did some testing, some digging. And then he told me that there had been a case way back 2 years before Roswell, in 1945, when there was no Air Force, there was no US Air Force. There was the word flying saucer hadn't been invented. This was before Kenneth Arnold, before all of that. In a little town called San Antonio, New Mexico, not the San Antonio in Texas, with witnesses who were still alive. And so I became interested in the case. I realized fairly quickly that Paola Harris had already done research there, had recorded interviews with the prime witnesses. So that's when we started working together. So Paola had a head start of about 3 years before I became involved in that particular case. So I think, we should let her explain how she became interested and how she uncovered this case, which is, for a scientist, the most interesting crash case certainly in American history.
Paula?
Yeah, the reason why this case is so important is we have the exact location, we have the witnesses, and this time we have 3 witnesses, but one has passed on, but I got to him before he passed and have, high quality video of him. And we have metal. The 9-year-old went inside the craft and pulled out a piece from the wall of this craft. So for me, it's like, as Jacques said, it's probably the most accurate case because we still have access to the location and the witnesses, and of course the metal. I was in Italy. I had read about it. 2 little Indian boys that saw a crash. I wondered why, the rest of my colleagues didn't just run down to Socorro, New Mexico and question the witnesses, because I had read about it when I was living in Italy in 2000. It was about 2005. I moved back to the United States in 2007. And by coincidence, and I know you study coincidences and all that dimensional stuff, Paul, by coincidence, the son of the pilot flew over that area that saw the 2 little Indian boys, and they weren't Indian, they were Hispanic, called me on another situation and told me that his father was the one that flew over there and saw the boys. So slowly but surely, I got hold of the 7-year-old who was by that time he was in his late 70s, Remy Baca. He was 7. Jose Padilla was 9. I got hold of the 7-year-old, and he recounted an incredible story and told me that he actually had the piece of metal that his friend Jose Padilla had taken from the inside of the craft. So what would I do? Like I always do, I flew to Gig Harbor, Washington, saw him in person, filmed him. By the way, this case is in Timothy Good's book. It's in one of his books because Timothy Good had been there before me. He's an incredible researcher because he does field research, which is what Jacques and I did for 4 years. Now, Remy Baca passed on. He died of diabetes. So it's a good thing I got him. I got his testimony. I had everything transcribed. So by the time that Jacques got everything in the first 3 years, he had the exact words of two boys that had the exact story. They didn't live or had seen each other for about 50 years. So it was totally amazing. So Jacques, you can tell them how you had to, piece together what I did. I just did the
Yes.
human side.
So what we try to do is combine the research that had already been done, which was a really excellent transcription of very detailed interviews separately and also jointly in some cases of the two witnesses, which by then were in their 70s and now 80s for Mr. Padilla, and who is still very much alive and has been helping us in every step of the investigation. And combining that with some of the more technical aspects about exactly what is the physics, as far as we can tell, of this object, where it came from, and what it meant at that particular time in history. One question that must be asked is, how come we only find out about this now? And how come, Paola has mentioned Timothy Good. There were a couple of other people who came by. Our friend James Fox had been invited by Paola to film there, but there didn't seem to be very much. I mean, those mentions in the literature are very brief. And the question is why? Well, the reasons are very simple. There are two reasons. Number one, the army that recovered the craft, and we'll go into that. It's an incredible story, because here we have the whole thing of how they did it, when they did it, who did it, and so on. Never spoke. The records are nowhere. Dr. Hynek was never aware of this case. It's not in the files of Project Blue Book. The Air Force was never formally brought into the case at any point. In 1945, there was no US Air Force. There were airplanes and there were pilots, but they were attached to the Army. It was the Army Air Force. The Air Force isn't going to exist until over 2 years later, after Roswell, in 1947 and so on. So what we have is two witnesses who are, young boys, 7 and 9. They know they are there before it happens. They are there while it happens. They see it happen. The craft crashes over their head, literally. And they have no idea, of course, that it's a UFO. They know that this is the end of the war. This is 2 days after the capitulation of Japan. So all the able-bodied men and women are in uniform, still in uniform. They have not been, demobilized yet. The kids are taking care of the property for their father. The property is a ranch in New Mexico, which is 80,000 acres. They are on horseback. They keep track of the cattle. They keep track of repairing the fences around the ranch. They are in charge of that. They have binoculars to track the cattle, to read the brands at a distance. So they are smart kids, and they know their territory very well. They know how to hide when something strange happens, but they will never talk about it. They never talk about it for 70 years. So you have, the government doesn't talk about it and the witnesses don't talk about it. So it took that one article, after 2000 that Paola read in Italy to really start our investigation. Why didn't they talk? Well, you would think that, by the time, of course, by the time of the sighting itself, they were not about to talk. For one thing, their father had told them, this is not something we can talk about. I mean, there was still a lot of suspicion around White Sands. So this property happens to be 25 miles from the place where the first atom bomb was detonated. Okay, this is a month after the test of the first atom bomb. They are within the military area. They are outside White Sands itself, but it's still considered, within the perimeter of the area. And there is a big tower on their property, which is a communication tower for the aircraft, because there are cliffs to the north of there that are dangerous for airplanes. So this is one of the towers controlling pilot communication around the entire White Sands, Alamogordo area, including Ground Zero. So the two kids are there. They hear a big crash. Something has hit the tower, and an object comes down and technically crashes on their property. Now, when we studied it and I was able to interview Mr. Padilla, it was clear that this is not an ordinary crash. An airplane, after hitting the tower, an airplane would have been broken into pieces, would have been crashed right there. The object is not a flying saucer. There is no flying saucer in our book. We talk about a number of cases that are similar to build a pattern. Remember, I'm a computer guy, so I like to look at patterns, not single events. The object is an ovoid. They call it an avocado. It's an egg-shaped object. It keeps its integrity after hitting the tower, and it crashes on the ground under control, and it goes down the hill, essentially digging up a boulevard all the way down the hill. It makes a turn, and it stops against a little hill. Those are the days at the end of the war. The kids know that when you're witness to an accident or to an event like this, the first thing you have to do, if you're the first witness on the scene, you have to offer help. So they rush down, they leave their horses, they rush down the hill, they get close to the object, and they realize this is no airplane. The one panel has been broken and ejected. They see inside the object, they see three little men, which sometimes they describe as small creatures, sometimes they say little men. They're about the size of the kids, about 3 or 4 feet. They seem to be in panic, but they are alive. They seem to be under stress, are crying like a rabbit, when you're going to kill the rabbit. So again, these are farm boys. They know reality. They've been exposed to all kinds of things. Okay, they know their territory. They know where they are. The first thing they realize they cannot help. What they can do is go report it to their father. Their father is going to call the state police and will come back 2 days later with a state policeman. The next day, they are not on the site. And as Paola said, a pilot, which is great because we have confirmation from people on the ground, the two kids, and a pilot that flew over the Alamogordo Tower, told that pilot that they had lost communication with the tower. That was the radio tower at the north end of the territory. And that could he take a look? And he takes a look at the tower, sees that the tower has been damaged. He reports that there is smoke on the ground close to the tower, and he sees the two kids that he calls Indian kids. Well, they are not Indian, as Paola said, they are Hispanic, but the The pilot reports all of that. So we have that correlation. We know it's not just some fancy story. The kids, let's go back to why the kids never said anything. Well, the kids, when the father goes to investigate with the state policeman, the kids follow with the family truck. The 9-year-old is driving the truck, okay? Remember, again, this is the end of the war, that somebody's got to drive the truck for the farm. So a 9-year-old kid can drive a truck. So he's driving the truck, and the four of them, the two kids, the father and the policeman, get to the site. They locate the object. Evidently, somebody from the Army Air Force has been on site the day before, because the site has been cleaned up and somewhat hidden so that the site is preserved. The little creatures or little men are not there anymore, but the object is sitting there by itself. The father and the policeman go inside. They are not abducted by anybody. They walk inside this object. They never told the kids what they saw inside. They sat down the kids and they said, look, nobody talks about this. We're going to report it to the authorities. It's on our land, but you don't talk about that. No, we don't want any rumors. We don't want any story. You know, this is too important. This is way above our head. Okay. They reported again formally, and the next day, the Army, the regular Army, not the Army Air Force, is going to come talk to the father and is going to initiate the recovery. During every day of the recovery, the kids are going to be there watching. Of course, this is the most fascinating thing to a kid. The kids know how to hide in the bushes, in the vegetation around the area, and they are going to watch and describe to Paola later in her interviews everything that happens day by day. In the book, in Trinity, we call the book Trinity the best kept secret, because it is. Again, after Roswell, the kids are not going to come out and tell the story. They keep their secret. One other reason why they keep their secret is that they've taken something from inside the object. On the last day, Jose Padilla, who is still alive, sneaks in. The object has been put on the trailer, ready to be taken back to the Manhattan Project. He sneaks inside, nobody's guarding it at that point, and he sees an instrument on a panel inside the object. He takes part of the instrument, and we have it. Okay, that's the story. He's not about to tell that story during all the commotion, all the circus around Roswell and everything else. They keep quiet. Both of the kids go on. Mr. Padilla joins the Army later as he grows up, goes to Korea. He's shot in Korea. And then he becomes a highway patrolman in California. We know his entire distinguished career, both in the Army and in the police. Remy Baca becomes an entrepreneur, moves to the state of Washington, runs a number of companies, and they actually are not in touch for a while, and they get reunited somewhat by accident in through the internet about a year or two before Paola starts her investigation. So that's a capsule, of the whole story. The case is incredible because it has about 10 things that you don't find in any other crash story. The witnesses are on site before the object arrives. They know the territory very well. They're able to recover material from the object. We have 2 other adults who went inside the object and they can describe what they saw. We have the pilot who saw the whole thing the first day. We have all these things that we can check, that we can document for, a scientific audience. And that's where it has to go. I mean, this is a case that scientists should look at. Now we are, the book, as you mentioned, has been out for a couple of months in English. It's doing very well, by the way. There is a French translation I can show you, Trinity, the best kept secret in French, that will be out within 2 weeks. And there is an Italian version. And we want to tell that story to the world because we want people with similar information, again, who can complete the pattern to understand what went on, because this happened not just in a place. It happened at the place where the first atom bomb was detonated. So in space and in time, we think, Paola and I think, it's a message. It's not just a crash. It's not just an accident. This is, maybe it's a donation, maybe it's a signal to us. This thing was designed to crash there and to get the attention of the American military and the attention, you could say, of mankind. The tests of the first plutonium bomb at White Sands a few weeks before was a turning point in the history of humanity. For the first time, we have the capability of destroying life on Earth. That's very clear. It's very clear to the scientists. I've read, in preparation for this, I've read historical books that have just come out after the 50-year period when many of the documents were locked up or were not available. Historians have started to write books about the whole thing. The Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, all these people left, memoirs, left traces in history about what it was like to be there. The explosion that took place in July 1945 was not a test. It was the first time an atomic bomb had been exploded, that it had the same power as a bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. It was the first plutonium bomb. It had the equivalent kiloton power as a real bomb that blew up Nagasaki. So this, in physics, when we do a test, you take a vial and you mix a few things and you do an experiment and you document the experiment. If it works, you try to get a patent, and then it becomes an industrial process. This was not a small experiment. This was a full-scale bomb. It was a full-scale bomb exploded at ground level, which is the worst thing they could have done. They showered the entire area within 100 miles in New Mexico. And we know when the direction of the winds and the precipitation in that area, that's all documented in our book day by day, the temperatures of precipitation and so on, and where the radioactive cloud went with the remains of the plutonium. They didn't tell anybody. They couldn't tell anybody because the test was supposed to be secret until the end of the war. So there is a drama there that I had never been told about. I mean, those are the things that I discovered as I was, following in Paola's footsteps, trying to understand the context of this thing. Nobody can say that this was just a random thing. Maybe Roswell was a random thing, an accident. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate signal to us. And I think the Atomic Energy Commission, which now is probably the custodian of that craft and possibly of the bodies, hasn't told anybody in the last 70 years either. Because again, this case is not in the Air Force archives on UFOs. It's nowhere. And the only way of classification in the United States where something can be kept at that kind of level of secret is for nuclear secrets. And in fact, the Canadian researcher who was given, much later, was given some residue from another crash in near New York, in New York State, to study in Canada, was told at the time that the UFO secrecy was higher than the nuclear secrets, the atom bomb. He was told, and he reported that. He said that, it's in the records, that he was told by the American authorities that this was classified higher than the atom bomb. And in our opinion, it still is. So there you are.
Well, before we begin our questions, Paula, do you have a further comment?
Jacques is brilliant in the way that he recapped that, but I do have comment in, because I know you're interested in the paranormal. So these two little boys are watching this and they're keeping secret, right? And people have been there and nothing happens. I've convinced Jacques that those beings at that time knew we were going to write a book about this at the right time. In other words, if you don't go through time and space, you don't believe, that time and space really are, as fast and as documented as they are, then you believe that there is no time and space. So those beings are looking at these little kids. And I remember Remy telling me that, I said, when you were looking at those beings, he said, well, they flashed me a vision of people falling out of skyscrapers. So Paul, what does that tell you? There is no skyscrapers he ever saw. I mean, not there in New Mexico, people falling out of skyscrapers. Doesn't that sound like September 11th? And
Sounds
then
like 9/11, yeah.
Yeah. And then then he said also that he and Jose had dreams. This is since you're interested in the paranormal, the unusual part of it. Jacques did an amazing job with the history, as you just heard. And where this was an Apache sacred burial place. I mean, a sacred ceremony place, because Geronimo was in that area. So when that thing landed, and you have to picture it, it's only it's less than 20 miles away from where the bomb, you can see Trinity through the mountains there, less than 20 miles away from where the bomb was exploded. It was next door to where the bomb was exploded. So look at the location. Look at the location. So that's why Jacques says it was deliberate, the location. The irony about it all, because the story is so complex, is that the Army told Mr. Padilla Faustino that it was a weather balloon that they asked to cut the gate. So Jacques and I've been there so often. In the last 4 years, we must have been there at least twice a year. And we've walked up to that gate. You can see where they cut the gate. The Army even made the road to take this thing out. And then they go to tell the Padilla family it's a weather balloon. And then the irony is Mr. Padilla said, well, we've got a couple of weather balloons in the bunkhouse we have to return to you because we've been picking them up on horseback. So of course they know it's not a weather balloon, because they've been picking up the weather balloons. But this thing is solid. So Jacques is correct about this thing. I mean, as far as metals, we found a witness just a year ago who said that she lived with Faustino Padilla, the father. She was a little girl at the time. She was one of the relatives. She said they found the foil. They were playing with the foil that was, would curl up and go back to the same shape. She said we didn't have slinkies or anything to play with, so we were playing with this foil. And the worst, I could see a movie around this. When that thing hit the tower, it spread out or spewed out some 10 pounds of angel hair, what they call angel hair, which it looks like spider web, which is all lit up in different colors. there may not be fiber optics, but they were all lit up all the time. So the two boys gathered all this stuff that was, lit up that looked like spider web, and they trimmed the Christmas trees with them. And she even says, I got some of that stuff. She said, we had it in the house in little plastic bags. It was all lit up. You take it into a dark room because we didn't have electricity. And she said it was all blue, green, purple. She said, but it would bite my hands. In other words, it irritated her hands. So Jacques and I are going steps further. We're getting scientists involved who can try to describe what that material was. Because it was not just that the boy walked in and took a piece off the wall. There was all of this 10 pounds of stuff that was all over the place that, looked like, it probably wasn't fiber optics, but it was all lit up. It looked like spider web, and the foil that Roswell talks about. So we have an advanced civilization that has a crash 1 month after the atomic bomb, 20 miles away. By the way, in the book, I think Jacques and I both felt very sad that the 70,000 people were not told that the bomb was going to go off. So Jose Badia's mother opens the door and she's blinded in one eye. She opens the door like at 5:45 and in the morning, and she said she sees the light of 1,000 suns. You can imagine what that looked like. And then Jose maintains he lost his eardrum from the sound of the blast. So none of these people were warned. It was radiation, 150-mile radius. There is a lot in the book that Jacques researched on a scientific level that will touch the hearts of people about that particular event. So I always kid around with them and I always say, Jacques, this is not a UFO book. This is a book of American history. And this should go in the historical part of any library, because we did the work, but this is the consequence of what happened.
Okay. Ben, you look as though you're bursting to ask questions.
Well, kind of. I did a little bit of research, kind of bone up on my Project Trinity stuff. I do think it's interesting that most of the reports I read, I'm just going to assume that they were heavily filtered. We're like, oh well, the radiation wasn't that bad, it was 1.0, or I think it was like 0.1 Röntgen or something was like floating around, and I was like looking at it and I was like, that doesn't seem right. I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure that's wrong. But I do find it interesting that it's not, obviously, it's not the first time that nuclear weapons or anything in that realm has been involved with ufology, before, right? There's a very clear link between the two. There's could be multiple reasons as to why. One of them could be, this is obviously a very powerful weapon in which, humanity could destroy themselves, So it's entirely possible that an extraterrestrial civilization would be like, hey, let's help these developing people not kill themselves. But I would like to kind of get your opinion on the sort of relationship between nuclear devices and UFOs, UAPs, whatever floats your boat in this scenario, because there's that connection, I think, is a lot deeper than I think a lot of other researchers give credit to, because there's definitely something about military bases having seen craft over them. Rendlesham Forest is a great sort of example that pops to mind, where there may have been nuclear devices, but we're not entirely sure. But I think that there's a very clear link. Do you have any more comments about that?
Sure. But we have to be very careful, especially if we want to get scientists involved, in not going beyond what we actually know. Okay.
Yeah, good point.
I'm not a nuclear physicist. We need, in all this, we need teams of people. I mean, I have a degree in astrophysics, but I haven't done astrophysics for a long time. My my professional activity has been in studying and investing in high technology companies and looking at physics from the point of view of information physics and information correlation and information structures, which is why in this book, I wanted to relate this observation to similar observations of similar quality. In other words, research by governments, where we have complete files in France and in other places where we could begin to look at a pattern. Again, I don't think any one case is going to ever convince anybody. It's not the Nimitz, it's not Roswell, it's not Kenneth Arnold. Those are unique things that are very interesting, but until you can put them in a framework. So you're asking about, the nuclear framework. Is there a relationship at that level? There are lots of reports from nuclear facilities. Now, again, I know what my colleagues are going to say. They're going to say, Jacques, nuclear facility, you always have guards around, people who look at the sky, people who monitor the environment because of security. So of course, if they see something in the sky, it's going to be reported. Now, if you're in the desert, or 200 miles, away from Mojave, something happens in the sky, nobody cares, okay? If it happens near a nuclear facility, somebody cares. I belong to the scientific review board for the French space agency that looks at UFO reports. France is the only country that has had a UFO study project for the last 40 years. And I've been asked to join that project. We look at reports from civilian and different government agencies in France and French territories. We have a report that, I have it here somewhere, from two workers who were outside a power plant, a nuclear power plant in France. France has a lot of nuclear energy for civilian use, but it has a perimeter around it. It's a nuclear power plant. It's not military. This is in the evening. The perimeter is lit up. Those two guys are finishing some work outside the plant. They see a black triangle, a very large black triangle, as big as a plant, flying over slowly, hiding the sky with perimeter lights. They try to take a picture of it. We have the picture. The picture is washed out by the lights from the perimeter, so we don't really see much of the object. But we believe them. This was reported officially to the French government, and the French Space Agency has interviewed them, and we have the record. We've been asked to look at it scientifically. Again, that's an example of a correlation between an object we don't understand and the nuclear domain. There have been a number of reports like that in the US. Under the NIDS project of Mr. Bigelow, there was a study done of a couple of 100 cases of that type in the US that were well documented. There is no question it happened. There is no question there is a correlation. It's complicated because there are, of course, inspections of those plants, including attempts to break the security, to test the security of the plants, that may be camouflaged in different ways. And they may be camouflaged as UFOs. So we know that takes place also. I've spoken to people who were on those airplanes camouflaged so that they could test the security of a military nuclear facility, okay? It takes some guts to go in, over the guns that are securing the facility, trying to look like something else to see, to test the security. So it's not simple. It's not black and white, but there is a correlation. There's always been a correlation with the nuclear. And again, We know that the nuclear project, the nuclear authorities in the US are the ones that recovered the object in San Antonio in New Mexico, that object that Paola and I have been studying. Now, looking at, extrapolating to, as Paola was saying, time and space, when I talk to physicists who are at the frontier of theoretical physics, they say, as Paola reflected, they say that time and space are not primary variables, contrary to what you and I learned in school, okay, a long time ago. Time and space are not the basic coordinates that we have to use here. There is something more fundamental that is beyond time and space, which is where physics is really working now. And time and space are what we measure because that's what we're aware of. I mean, these are the things we can measure, in everyday life. But at the basic fundamental level of physics, there is something more fundamental, including possibly time reversal, including coincidences. And that's where, parapsychology has been struggling to come to the same, things that were precognition, for example, which has been studied by a number of academic institutions, including Princeton University, including SRI here in California. We have these experiments of things being predicted, things being seen, remote viewing, that has been extensively studied with government projects. So we have to go back to the witnesses and ask them about this, which is rightly, what Paola has done from the beginning. One of the things that they say is, we ask them, how long were you there looking on the first day, looking at this object that just appeared on your land, and you're less than 200 feet away. I mean, they were ready to go help. The little one was crying. He was saying, no way, I'm not getting involved in this. I'm too scared. I don't want to go close to this. Mr. Padilla, if he had been alone, would have gone in. And as he told Paola, if I had gone in, I wouldn't be here now, talking to you about it. We asked them, how long were you there? And they said maybe 20 minutes. And then we had to go home and tell our father. We think they were there when we reconstruct the time. They were there probably as long as 2 hours. Well, I have 2 kids. When they were 7 or 9, I couldn't get them to stand still for 2 hours. No way. They might stand still for 10 minutes if I read them a story, but then they would go off and do something else.
You should have seen Ben.
There was something, and they said there was some communication with these creatures. There was something happening there that was unique, that was at the psychic level.
There is a tremendous disadvantage, I think, that we have in our particular areas of study, which is the use of empirical evidence, right? So it's, we typically, you guys managed to luck out because you have plenty of empirical evidence to point to say, well, we know that this was here. We have this physical evidence here. But typically, usually you have witness reports, which is just sort of a subjective experience of an objective reality. In this case, we know something crashed and we have witnesses there and we have corroborating reports. If there weren't like physical pieces, kind of putting all of this together, this puzzle together, how would one present this in such a way so that we have the correlations, we have the patterns, we have subjective experiences that we can say, okay, we have reports, we have them recorded, we have them transcribed, we have these pieces, we have these experiences, this evidence. How would one present this to show we know that something is going on beyond the perceived reality?
So
For one thing, you have to look, I'm going to, Jacques, talk about the fact they were children. When you had the case in Rwanda in Africa, you may have seen the phenomena by James Fox. They questioned the kids. The kids in that playground saw something. The kids they were kind of traumatized, but children are different from adults when they give testimony. There was also the Westall case where that craft in Australia landed. That's in the movie The Phenomena. Jacques and I had the privilege of speaking to children who had grown up. These were children, and they had no frame of reference because there was no Kenneth Arnold, there was no flying saucer. They didn't know what the heck was there. They could only compare it to themselves. And the three witnesses were children below the age of, they were under the age of 11. So to make up something like that, it would be absolutely impossible in 1945. That's 76 years ago. So Jacques, I don't know what you were going to say, but we lucked out in that this was the recollection of kids. Jacques, what were you going to?
So I had the privilege of working at first, working from the transcripts of the interviews that Paola had done. That are, Paola is a trained journalist and, has a trained educator. She has worked with children in schools, in the American school in Italy and so on. So it's generally, recognized that kids are more precise when they are describing, for example, a car accident than adults, because adults tend to project their life experiences into what they've seen. A kid doesn't have that, and the kid doesn't have isn't trying to impress you with how much he knows and in unrelated areas. The kid just tell you what they've seen and with their own emotions. So I think that's very strong from that point of view. My wife, whom I lost 10 years ago, was a child psychologist. And in cases where the witnesses were kids, she was always with me and taught me how to, assess what a child is telling you. So I went through the transcripts, and the transcripts are very interesting, and I preserved them in the book very extensively, because when you read the transcript, you see now they are not kids anymore when Paola interviews them. They're in their 60s or 70s, but they go from the past tense, which is, I got on my horse and my father told me this, and I went there and I saw the soldiers and I did that. And then they get to the site, they describe the object and they say, and the creatures are moving. I'm not looking, I'm trying not to look at them. I'm scared, I'm doing this. And they're talking in the present. They don't realize that they've just gone from the past tense to the present. The scene is back in their mind. This is, there are certain things that you never forget. The assassination of President Kennedy. I know exactly where I was. You can talk to most Americans who were alive then, will remember where they were at that particular time. They can talk about it in the present. So that's very striking in both transcripts, multiple transcripts of the two kids, in quotes, as they recall that scene. Now, what's remarkable, again, is that the kids were there for the following 7 days. And we've reconstructed what happened day by day by day. I went back and took the weather records to check what they said about the weather, the temperatures, the rain over the next few days. I can visualize it because I've been on that site a number of times. And then we can look at in two ways. First, with Mr. Brody, who was the pilot of that bomber that was coming in for the landing at Alamogordo at the same time. He's asked to check the tower because they've lost communication with the tower. So we can log that. I mean, this is not something that Jose Padilla has invented as a little kid. You know, he is there the same day. He sees the fire. The craft is not on fire. In one of the books, in Timothy's book, he talks about the fire. The craft set the vegetation on fire, but the craft itself did not suffer any fire. The pilot sees the smoke, describes the smoke, and he sees the two little kids there. So that locks everything on the first day. And then later on, the fact that Paola found the third witness, she was not a witness to the crash, but she came into the family at the site when she was 2 months old, and she grew up there. And she describes what the site was like, and what she describes the materials that had been recovered from the object by Mr. Padilla and by Mr. Padilla's father, Faustino Padilla. And those were the shining, what people have called fiber optic. Well, fiber optic doesn't glow like that. This was a very interesting material that has been described in a number of other cases, including Roswell. The material that keeps its shape, the shape material where you can put it into a ball and it will extend again. Well, that material was later developed, and the question is, was it already developed at the time of Roswell? But it certainly was not developed at the time, 2 years before Roswell. There are a number of companies that have been involved in that material that were also involved in testing recovered materials, and we know that now, including Battelle Memorial, which is one of the outstanding sites in the US for testing of metallurgical material. And we know that Battelle has been involved since the days of Project Blue Book in the recovery and testing of cases, and also in the statistical study of UFOs. So there are a number of those companies. IBM was another one where advanced materials were tested. So this is all coming out now, and it should come out. The scientific community should be given access to all of that.
Well, I think that we're coming down to the end here. We have about 200 questions we're not able to get to, but perhaps we have time for one. Paola will tell you, Jacques, that we are very much into defining terms and extending thought beyond the normal paradigm that we rather narrowly adhere to. As far as where this craft, when, how this craft came from and arrived in New Mexico, who the occupants were, what their nature truly was, I think of a quote, probably my favorite quote, from our mutual friend Stanton Friedman, who said, if I can remember it correctly, "We are a primitive species whose primary activity is tribal warfare. Why would they want to talk to us?" Going back to your point that this may have been a deliberate attempt at communication. What say you, Jacques?
Well, what we're doing with nuclear, in the book, we go deeply into the history of the Manhattan Project and what the people thought at the end of the war, when the scientists themselves were, and the military, were presented with the results of what they had done, which was the devastation of Japan. And they went through very, very deep, self awareness and self-questioning, whether they were religious or not, Catholic or not. Some of them said we want nothing more to do with nuclear. We'll go back to normal physics. We'll go back to teaching. Others wanted to remain involved to secure nuclear material. They knew that sooner or later the Soviet Union would have a bomb, and that we had to begin to have safeguards, international safeguards, which is coming back again now. A number of countries, some of them completely irresponsible, have the power to detonate a nuclear weapon. Now, we don't know if there are other forms of life in our environment, never mind other planets. They may have their own concerns because they may know something about the atom that we don't know. So maybe we should take those signals, seriously when something like this happens at the site of the first nuclear explosion within, a few weeks of that explosion right at the place. Okay, it's hard to say that this wasn't presented to us as, okay, now you think you're really smart because you have the bomb. Now make sense of this, because I've tried to go as far as I could in looking at the physics of this thing. And that led to some amusing arguments with Paola, because Paola was saying, why do you want to know how many wheels there were on the military truck? Well, I need to know, what's important is the meaning for mankind and all of that. Well, that's true, and the little boys and their testimony. But I need to know about the truck, because, this is not a weather balloon. When you send an 18-wheeler with what the Army called a lowboy, and you have to build a crane on site, miles from anywhere on this piece of land, we have to build a crane, which was probably a 15 to 20-foot crane that they had to erect to lift the thing. Reconstructing the truck, the 18-wheeler and everything else, we know the thing was probably in the area of 5 tons. The kids tried to move it, okay? Those kids were smart. They wanted to know, they were intrigued by this. They couldn't budge it. It was put on the trailer sideways because this oval object couldn't go under the overpass if it was standing up on the trailer. Okay, so this was real. I mean, this is not just some ghost or some imagination. A ghost may be real, by the way, don't get me wrong, but this I want to get into trouble with you, but this was very real and very material. They can look at the underside now that it's on the trailer. That's where the propulsion system has to be. There is no opening. We know the size of the object. We know inside it's about 13 feet high. We know the floor is flat. We've gone through all these interrogations with them. There is about 2.5 or 3 feet under the floor. That's where a propulsion system is. There is no room to put, a jet engine or anything else. So if it's anti-gravity or whatever we want to call it, it has to be beyond anti-gravity. This is not just anti-gravity.
Okay.
It's a space-time propulsion system that we don't understand. There is no opening there.
Well, we have about 35 shows to go before we can get to that. Paula,
Yeah, well,
used to our
here's the
eccentric
book.
thought patterns. What have you got there?
This
Tell
is
us
the
about the book.
actual book. It's called Trinity. The cover is not of a UFO book. That's Jose Padilla as a child and his grandmother, Mama Grande, who was an Apache. And this is why Jacques and I did this cover, because I want to stress, apart from the UFO that's in there, this is a historical document. Most of our work is going, both Jacques and my work, and Whitley Strieber's is going to Rice University. We're already shipping our archives there in the Department of Religious Studies. Even the piece from inside that craft is going to Rice University in Houston.
Outstanding.
Cool.
Well, I want to thank you both for a tremendous show. Ben, you can close us up, but I just want to point out that on July 25th, Paula's going to be back on our regular radio show. BehindTheParanormal.com will give you all the information, and we'll talk more about this case. And if you're listening after that date, the show will have been posted on the major podcast platforms as well as at the show site. Ben?
Indeed, and you can tune into our regular weekly radio show, Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, now in our 14th year, every Sunday at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific on WOON AM and FM, so that's 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in the Boston Providence area, streaming live on the Paranormal Radio app, TalkStream Live, and WOON radio channel on YouTube. Visit BehindTheParanormal.com and the all major podcast platforms for recorded shows going back to 2008. And many thanks to our distinguished guests. And in the words of the late, great WOON radio colleague of ours, Joe Ferrier, keep watching the skies.